We want to say hello to everybody out there in TV, radio, internet, and other lands. This is a call to action, and I'm your host, Alex C. Habersham. And I want to tell you up front, you're going to really be interested in this story and my interviewee for the day. So, after you will have heard it, you can pass it on by going to YouTube, Alex Habersham YouTube, or going to makingblackpages.com so you can share the story. I'm so happy. And you know, fate is a strange thing, because oftentimes circumstances and situations happen to us and we don't know why, but they just occur. And for some reason, and I can't totally remember, but a few weeks ago, I decided to call this young lady because I heard her story or read her story or was associated with her relative here and just decided to call her and we talked. And then I learned more about her story, particularly as it relates to ethnicity and her art. And she really has a story to tell because it kind of reflects, you know, what race has done in the country. It kind of reflects how we as African Americans have bounced back and how we bounce back on a regular basis. And it kind of reflects how sometimes the segregation and depression are very real. And then they are real from a societal, if I may use that word, Coley, from a society perspective. So I have with me today uh, a phenomenal young lady in the person of Miss Nicole Persley, also AKA Coley. And she has some roots and some ties in Macon and in Central Georgia because she discovered some things that I'm gonna let her tell you about. But just go ahead and just kind of introduce yourself, and you can delve right into the story about how you really found the lineage, if I may use that term, as it relates to being a Persley. And then she's going to talk about, her relatives in Macon because they were phenomenal individuals, very talented, contributed a lot to the community. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Miss Nicole Persley. Take it away, Coley.
Thank you, Mr. Habersham. I'm really honored that you invited me to tell my story. I love sharing this story, and my hope is that my story will inspire conversations that can be healing, enlightening, and of course, interesting. So um, my last name Persley may be familiar to Maconites. There's a street named Persley Street that is in Pleasant Hill, and that street is connected to my family's lineage in Macon. I was unaware of this until in my college years, I became interested in doing some genealogical research. And I don't want to date myself, but this was before DNA tests, this was before the internet. And the way I was doing my research was traveling to various libraries around the country and researching the archives. And what I was trying to find was any story that could help me piece together information about my ethnic background and my genealogy. Um, I grew up in a small rural town in Virginia, and I was not told anything about the family's legacy and how it pertains to African American history and achievements. So when I traveled to Macon to the Washington Memorial Library, my mother came with me to help me research. And I was bracing myself for a journey that would possibly take years, months to find some kind of information that would be a lead because I didn't know what side of my family to start looking on, my mom or my dad. But I came to Macon, and I went up to the librarian who was working at the time and asked him if he'd heard of an architect named Louis Persley. I knew I had an uncle named Louis Persley. He's my great uncle, to be specific, my grandfather's full brother. And he comes back with this thick folder. He's like, yeah, of course. Everyone knows Lewis Persley. Hands it to me. My mom and I go back. She's got her own folder. I've got the Lewis Persley folder. I open it up, and the very first page in that folder was a copy of a book called Progress for a Race. Outstanding achievements, outstanding African American achievements. I don't think they said that because the book was published in the 20s. My uncle was featured in it as the first African American architect to register with the State Board of Georgia. And so in that moment, in my first endeavor, I hit the jackpot and I was thrilled. My jaw drops. I was like, wow, processing this, because what I was unpacking at that moment was the fact that this was my grandfather's full brother. So that meant my grandfather was also African American. And I'd never been told that. I was completely relieved I would not have to spend 10 years searching. And at the same time, I was processing, well, where did the lie start? Who covered this up? Why? When? What family members know about it? Like, so many questions were just immediately swirling in my head. And I've been interviewed many times and told this story, and I'm a bit cautious on how I word it now because it was misinterpreted that I was somehow upset by this, but the truth is I was thrilled, and it is just a very mixed range of emotions. Miss Muriel Jackson. Oh my gosh, I can't remember her name of the last name.
Jackson.
Dang, yeah, Miss Muriel Jackson.
Yeah.
She worked there then. This is 1995. And she came out and took my mother and I, she stopped what she was doing and took us immediately to Linwood Cemetery, where the Persley family has a plot. Uncle Lewis is there. My great-grandfather, T.K. Persley, is there. My great-grandmother, Maxie Bond Persley, is there. And their youngest son, Phil Persley, is there. My grandfather is buried in Detroit, and we have one other uncle, Uncle Thomas Persley. He's buried in Chicago. So that day, I learned so much about my family, and it's been almost 30 years, and I've been researching it consistently. Sometimes I'm more passionate. I have more time to dedicate towards it, and sometimes I'm like too busy with other things in my life. But the last few years, I've been very fortunate to have the time to visit Macon and meet more people from Macon and tell my story to various organizations. And it's always a pleasure for me to do that. I love Macon. One of our friends calls it my ancestral home.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's very true. Well, let me ask you a question. So, in growing up, what ethnicity did you think you were?
I thought that we were. I knew about my Irish ancestry. My mother researched. She was kind of into researching her ancestry because on her side we have some Native American family, and she never really got the full story on that. So I knew, like, on her side of the family there was some untold history as well. I thought I was just European and Native American, and that was really about it.
So, so you didn't know that in fact you were African American or had a high, well, I guess that's about what, 25%? So your dad was totally African American, half 50%, or do you know?
Yeah, well, his mother was Irish Catholic. His
Okay.
father was African American. My grandfather was my father's father. But and my father's name was Alonzo, and my grandfather's name was Alonzo. Um, we call my grandfather Doc. Now, I'd heard many stories about Doc, it was always, he was a hero. I heard stories like he was like Superman. I never got to meet him. He died before I was born. But my aunts and my father, they all told like he was like their, he became a saint to them. And so I knew that he went to the University of Michigan, which is also my alma mater. My father wanted me to go to the University of Michigan to honor Doc. He couldn't get into Michigan, my dad, so he wanted me to go. And just that, I did not have the full story. Now, when I was in Macon at the library, I mentioned it was 1995. My father passed away in 1994. So if I could have called him immediately, I would have, but unfortunately, he
Well,
wasn't.
did he know that?
That's the question. I don't know the answer to that. If he knew, he was white passing. I don't know if Doc told his children and his wife. I don't know if Doc stayed in touch with his frat brothers. He was the president of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity at the University of Michigan when he was in medical school. And my friend, I have some historical researcher friends, one of whom is in Alpha Phi Alpha in Detroit and Ann Arbor. And, like Dave said, there's no way he could not have stayed in touch with some of his fraternity brothers who were also practicing medicine in Detroit at the time. But there's really no way to prove that unless I find some kind of letter or diary or something, and there's very limited
Yeah. So, so,
personal
so you
item.
think passing goes back to your grandfather?
I
You know.
do. I do know that he checked the white box on certain documents, but he
Okay.
did not start doing that till a certain point in his life.
Yeah.
As a
Okay.
young man, he grew up in Macon's Pleasant Hill. His father, T.K. Persley, was the professor at, I want to say it was Green Street.
Yeah. Green
Okay,
Street Elementary.
so some some of the documents called TK a professor. Some of them call him the principal. The census records all acknowledge he was an educator at several different early schools in Pleasant Hill in Macon. And so was his wife, my great grandmother, Maxie Bond Persley. She was also an early educator. So they met at one of the schools and married.
Yeah.
Um, but all of this family I'm talking about, we're all very light skinned. So much so that, you any one of the Pursleys had the ability to pass for white if they chose to.
Right. Right.
Lewis Pursley ended up being recruited by Booker T. Washington to join the faculty and help construct Tuskegee's original campus.
Wow.
So when my grandfather kind of joined the northern migration to Detroit, and so did Thomas, who went to Chicago, Lewis remained in the South, and the younger brother Phil remained in the South.
Right. Right. Well, that's just such a phenomenal story. So I know that you're trained as an artist.
Yes.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is a call to action. I'm your host, Alex Habersham, interviewing Miss Nicole Persley. So we're going to move into another phase of your life. So you can talk a little bit about your son because I just think it's so interesting. But what it proves is that judging people should be based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And if we could kind of lean more toward that philosophy, boy, this would be a better place and a better world. But you're also an artist, as
Yes.
evidenced by the pictures, illustrations behind you. So, and I think that I read somewhere where you try to intertwine your art with colorism and make it send a message in what you do. So, talk a little bit about your art.
Okay. Well, My usual style is represented by the pieces behind me. But a few years ago, I started to paint on brown paper bags. And what I did is I did a whole series of the family members I just talked about. I painted their portraits on brown bags. And I did this to talk about colorism and show that the brown bag was used as a way to measure the skin tone of people by institutions, some colleges, certain organizations, and it eliminated many people, and it gave privilege and access to lighter skinned people.
Okay,
So
explain that a little more. I've heard that story, but about the brown bag. How would they use that bag?
so the story goes that, let's say a woman was applying for a job at a fine department store. They would interview her and then like hold the brown bag up to her face. If she was lighter than the brown bag, she was
Wow.
hired. If she was darker, they would say, please go somewhere else. You're not the right fit. I don't know exact language they would use, but that was colorism.
Now that means, hey, Coley, that means I'll still be looking for a job.
Yeah, I believe
so,
so.
so you use that concept to you use art to make certain philosophical and societal expressions, and do you still continue to do that?
I'm still exploring it. I'm still trying to figure out a way to do it where the message is clear and it tells the history in a better way. Right now, it's personal. It's about me connecting with my family again and telling their story. But I think if I continue to do this, there's a way to really get the message out there. And well, I don't know if I have some ideas. If I talk about them, then they won't be as effective because there's like a surprise element involved. But I would like to have someone who is not aware of the history, and this happens often because that's not that's not a very well known history. Like, not everyone knows about the brown bags. And the last time I had like an expo with them, almost everyone that was there had not heard of it. Um, and they were fascinated by the history. I think that a lot of the younger generations today would absolutely not believe that these things
Yeah,
existed and they were real. And I think it's a powerful way to get that history
right,
across, a
right.
subtle but powerful way.
Well, speaking of young people, so how did you grow up? I mean, what kind of friends you had? What did they think about you? Did they accept you as being white? Just how did that happen?
Well, I attended Catholic school up until like fourth grade. And like I said, we grew up in a rural area. So I was very outdoorsy. I was into horses. Um, we had like a farm. So I was outside with chickens and cows and horses. I was like a country girl at best. When I think of my childhood, it was a lot of alone time. I did have friends at school. It was a small school when I stopped going to the Catholic school. It was still a small school. It was not diverse, and I did not really have any exposure to any kind of African American culture, except um, Howard University's radio station came in pretty clearly, and I used to listen to that, and I did not know at the time that that was Howard's radio station. I found that out later. I thought that was interesting. That was really the only kind of culture I had as an influence growing up in rural Virginia.
So you grew up as a white girl.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep. My school's nickname was Cow Pie High. It was literally in like the middle of a cow field.
yeah. Well, that's certainly outstanding. So moving forward, as it relates to your art
Mm-hmm.
and your research and your genealogical um, exercises. So where do you go from here? And I think that you have gotten some exposure from other outlets as it relates to your story. But I mean, I think it's a message in that. And you mentioned it when you talked to the Central Georgia Coalition of Black Businesses on Wednesday, is that, a person should not have to utilize what happens when a brown paper bag is put up against their face. That should not be a determinant of
Mm-hmm.
the value and the
Mm-hmm.
qualifications and the soul of that person. So, I mean, I think this is really important. You brought that point out. You brought that point out that it seemed to be the motivation of, your relatives to pass because they wanted the privileges.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that there was a difference in the privileges. So where do you think you'll be taking that, moving forward, if anywhere?
I think that history, like the brown bag test, is essential right now to talk about because so many people are either unaware or it's not allowed to be talked about. And I live in a state where if I wanted to have a lecture on this, it would have to be in a private building. You know, it's it's evidence of what a lot of people are in denial about, and it creates conversations that become very meaningful and healing. Um, I spoke about this at the roundtable that this research for me has personally been very healing. Um, Initially, I was resentful that my grandfather made the difficult decision to pass for white. And the more I educated myself about Jim Crow laws that were in place, specifically to hold him back, no other reason than to make sure he did not advance. He and everyone else that was trying to gain a higher education and get ahead, there were laws, local laws with various medical associations, state laws, federal laws, um, and there were few hospitals that had been built at that time. The infrastructure was being built when he was entering his medical career. One of the things I found out, which is another interesting point, is when Doc was practicing in Detroit, he was on the staff at one of the hospitals that had not been integrated at that time. So he was white passing for sure at that
Mhm.
hospital.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if he white passed in his medical office that was at his home. He lived in a historically black neighborhood, um, and his office was there. So I think he kind of like went back and forth. But I'm saying all this to say that this history, yeah, it was suppressed for me, whether it was passively suppressed, no pun intended, or he made an effort not to tell the truth because he thought it was going to help him and his family get ahead in life. So I gained compassion for him and forgiveness, understanding the history. And I think that's just a small example of how history can heal. It should be talked about. It should create these conversations, even the difficult conversations, because there's a lot of stigma around racial passing. And I'm not ashamed to say that my grandfather passed for white. I always try to follow it up though with why he made that difficult choice, because I don't want anyone criticizing him. I've never met him, but I do love him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I truly understand that. And it's strange how genes and DNA work, because I think that well, I know that you were married to a Caucasian and you have one son, and I think you mentioned to me what you told your then husband at the time.
Well, when I met my ex-husband now and I became pregnant, well, he knew. I told him my whole story. I already knew, because I was like in my early 20s when I made my Macon trip. But we were talking about genetics, and he's a scientist, so he's kind of like thinks about things like this. I was like, do not accuse me of being unfaithful. It's very possible that our child will come out looking extremely African American. DNA has a tendency to skip generations. And my son's skin tone is probably darker than any Persley's in 5 generations. So I was, again, like, I think my intuition was saying that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
FYI, yeah, I have taken a DNA test. My son has taken a DNA test. My ex-husband has. It's definitely his father.
Wow, such an interesting story. Well, let me tell you how much I appreciate your story. And even more importantly, let me tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to tell that story. Not because it's drama, but because of what it can mean to helping to build bridges and eliminate divide in our community, because that supports what Dr. King said. People should be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. This is a
Right.
call to action. I'm your host, Alex Habersham. Coley, thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for your story. Oh, yeah. I'm telling everybody right now that we want everybody to put pencil in July 13th, 2025 on your calendar, because we're going to have a celebration. A
Yes. Thank you.
phenomenal architect from Macon, Georgia, Mr. Lewis Hudson Persley. This is a call to action. I'm your host, Alex Habersham. Have a great day.
www.makingblackpages.com